Um, So just as the relevance of sustainability within anaesthetics and within the NHS. So firstly, the NHS is aiming to be net zero on direct emissions by 2040. Like across the country, carbon footprint, the NHS makes up 5% of the UK's total carbon emissions. So we're quite a large percentage. And out of the total NHS carbon footprint, department accounts for 5% of the total NHS carbon footprint. So it is quite relevant to our specialty. Looking specifically at nitrous oxide, it has many anaesthetics. So we use it for analgesic effects, second gas effect, concentration effect, etc. Minimal decrease in uterine tone. So it definitely has a place within anaesthetics. It does, however, have some disadvantages. So it can affect B12 metabolism, and from an environmental perspective, has a global warming potential 8 times carbon dioxide's global warming potential, stays in the atmosphere for up to 120 years, contributes 6% of global greenhouse emissions on its own. Impressive. It's more than 75% of our total anaesthetic gas carbon footprint, and since CFCs have been banned, it's now the dominant ozone depleting substance. So it is something that obviously has significant negative environmental impacts, but we obviously still need to use it for some indications in anaesthetics. And so that takes us on to how we can mitigate some of the negative effects of nitrous. So the nitrous mitigation project was started by a pharmacist called Alifia Shakira, who works up in Scotland. She observed at her hospital that during COVID, when no elective surgery was going on, the rate of consumption of nitrous at their manifolds remained unchanged, which is obviously quite unusual. So then they decided to compared to their consumption at their manifold between 2019 and 2020. The results were quite impressive. So they consumed 790 of nitrous at the manifold that year. 0.5% of that was used clinically and 99% was wasted. And that's due to a variety of reasons, including expired into atmosphere, over provision, leaks in pipelines, theft. And so what that comes down to is essentially, as you can see there, nearly 500,000 carbon of wastage, and that's the same as sort of just over 1 million miles driven by a gas-powered car, or sort of providing homes over 1 year. So a considerable amount of wastage there. And as a result of that, they decided to decommission their manifolds and to use local nitrous cylinders in their hospital. This project has been presented at many different sustainability meetings across the country and has since been endorsed by the Association of Anaesthetists. And they're now encouraging all UK hospitals to try to see, if other hospitals can reduce their wastage of nitrous as well. If we look in our area, this audit was repeated by Guy's and St Thomas's, and they found that they had an annual pipeline supply of 2.9 million litres of nitrous. They clinically use 421,000 litres of nitrous, which results in 2.5 million litres of nitrous just being wasted every year, so 86% of their pipeline supply. So as a result of that, they're considering terminating their pipeline supply in some parts of the hospital in favour of using portable cylinders. Other hospitals in our area, such as King's and the Evelina, are collecting data for this project as well, but don't have the results yet. So this is essentially what we've decided. So the way we've done it, we've looked at our clinical usage of nitrous. So we've gone through all the data logs of our anaesthetic machines, and the data available to us is from February 2020 and 2022, so that's a 27-month period. And we had help from Draeger with this, who gave us a software update, so we were able to access all this information. We then looked at our consumption of nitrous. So pharmacy provided us with data on the number of cylinders were purchased during the same time period that we have the anaesthetic logs from. And we've looked to the portal on number of cylinder changes as well. We've also had an assessment of our stock management. So we've been to the manifolds with the estate's engineers. We've looked at our expired stock, and we've reviewed which clinical applied by which manifolds at the 2 different hospitals. So then looking at our results and how we compare. So looking at both hospitals, so the amount we've purchased over this sort of just over 2-year period. So we purchased sort of 1.1 million litres of nitrous over at Lewisham and 500,000 litres nearly. From that, over at Lewisham, just under 500,000 litres of that we bought were connected to the manifold. We're not entirely sure what the rest of that. And out of that 500,000 litres that we had at Lewisham, 152,000 litres was used clinically. So there's obviously quite a big difference there. And the same with bullet data on what was actually connected to the manifold, but there's obviously quite a large discrepancy there between what's been used clinically and what has been purchased by the hospital. Just to point out as well, this is purely just thinking about, not Entonox. Entonox has its own separate manifold at both hospitals and separate pipeline system. So if you look at how much we're wasting there, so over that 27-month period, we've wasted 1 million litres of nitrous, which is 87% of what we've purchased. And over at Woolwich, we've wasted some nearly 400,000 litres of nitrous, which is 80% of what's been purchased. And if we look at sort of what that equates to with regard to carbon dioxide equivalents and equivalent miles driven by a petrol car, that's sort of 1.5 million miles at Lewisham, and also a huge amount over at Woolwich as well. And the cost of that wastage can be seen on the screen there also. So we're just going to move in more detail about where the nitrous actually goes once we buy the stock in, attach it to the manifold. So Dan's going to talk you through that now quickly as well.
Introduction I had. So I had a very insightful opportunity to go around with the Beacon Meads gas engineer and the porters who manage the cylinders at Lewisham, and actually have a look at the maths going on there, how many we actually have, and the system that they have for recording when the cylinders are changed and when maybe they notice they've expired. So one that supplies our main theatres in Nigel Wyviat and Labour Ward. We've got one that supplies Riverside theatres, and then there is an additional one called Outpatient Department and Pharmacy Ramp, which supplies X-ray. Now, the curious thing about that one is it supplies one anaesthetic machine that has never had nitrous ever run through it. From talking to the radiographers and the staff there, is they do not use nitrous clinically, and it's only when we get involved that there's a potential use. Now, having a little bit more of a look at how there's a setup. So the manifolds are completely different to what I read for my primary exams. I assumed that they were all on scales and you'd weigh left. But actually, if you look at the picture on the left-hand side, that's how a manifold is set up. You have two banks, a right bank and a left bank, and one is active at any moment in time. The pressure starts to decrease in one of the banks, and that's when it gets to 20 bar for nitrous. It swaps over and the other bank kicks in, so you've got a continuous supply. You are reliant on supply to this system. So as you can see on the right-hand side picture, that's our emergency reserve manifold. And that is there in the case of a power failure, and it's purely pressure driven. You use a pipeline supply. The problem with these setups is that actually there's a huge amount of nitrous contained in those manifolds, which is very different to what we're seeing in the turnover. And what I discovered was actually at specifically the manifold that supplies X-ray is that of the full system, there was 15 of them, 11 of them had expired. So it's about 117,000 litres of nitrous that have been sitting there gathering dust over 36 months. The problem with that is that when those cylinders go back to BOC, who supply our medical gases, by law they're allowed to just vent them to atmosphere. So that goes straight up to contributing to that global warming potential. So there's an issue there with it not being used, and actually the laws around how they're disposing of them and breaking it down. Interestingly, I got to speak to some of the porters and estate staff, and we discussed whether there'd been any thefts. Now, I think around a disinformation request that between 2010 and 2020 across both sites, there had been 60 G cylinders stolen from across the trust. I mean, I have no idea what kind of setup people have to steal and heavy, but at University Hospital Lewisham specifically, in the past 5 years, we've had 22 G cylinders stolen. And there was quite an interesting report. It was the fairground folk who'd stolen it to power up the carousel. I'm not aware of the use of nitrous in that instance, but the idea of a carousel going around at 100 miles an hour was quite amusing. So I'm going to hand over to Imran now to talk about the survey that he puts out to everyone. And just tell me when you want the slides to be swapped.
Yeah. So yeah, we just wanted to know what people thought about nitrous and what their which way the departments are inclined towards the topic. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah. So we actually got quite a good response. We got 50 responses, and fairly equal response rate between QE and UHL. Most of the responses were from consultants and trainees. And the first thing we wanted to do is establish what people knew about the issue. And so we asked them the question: oxide contributes how much of the total NHS anaesthetic gas footprint? And if you can remember, Anne Harrod said at the start of the talk, contribution through nitrous oxide is 75%. And what we found was that 7 out of 10 respondents underestimated this contribution that nitrous oxide makes to our anaesthetic carbon footprint. Next slide. And we also asked how long does nitrous oxide remain in the atmosphere? As you're aware, volatile gases like sevoflurane and desflurane, isoflurane are all harmful to the atmosphere, but they have relatively short half-lives compared to nitrous oxide, which remains in the atmosphere for up to 120 years or more. And we find that 1/5 of respondents underestimated the lifespan of nitrous oxide in the atmosphere. Next slide. And so the key question is, how often are we as anaesthetists using it? And we find that the vast majority of anaesthetists never or very rarely use nitrous oxide in the adult non-obstetric situation. So the vast majority, 92% of us, we aren't using it for these type of general adult cases. Next slide. However, obviously the pattern is different for obstetrics, where the frequency of use was much more mixed amongst anaesthetists, with some people never using it and some people using it either rarely, occasionally, or more frequently than that. Next slide. And we find that 2/5 of anaesthetists regularly or always use nitrous oxide for maintenance of their obstetric anaesthesia. Next slide. Obviously, nitrous oxide use in pediatrics, particularly at induction via inhalation, was popular. Next slide. Where 2/5 of anaesthetists regularly or always use nitrous oxide at induction. But we find that only 1/10 of anaesthetists were regularly or always using nitrous oxide to maintain anaesthesia in pediatric patients. Next slide. We also asked for some free text comments, and we find that there was a balance between comments that were supportive of the use of nitrous oxide or had positive things to say about nitrous oxide, and there was a balance between the negative comments that we got. And some of the positive comments mentioned themes such as uterine tone or cardiovascular stability, reducing the incidence of awareness in obstetrics, or some people described it as being essential for pediatric inhalational inductions. And similarly, when there was negative comments, people were fairly commonly using the same theme, i.e. they don't use it very often and it has a massive environmental impact. Next slide. So to summarize, we also finally asked them how important is nitrous oxide to your clinical practice, and I think this graph just shows that there was a fairly diverse range of opinions. So I think there's 2 anaesthetists that rated it as 10, the most important thing possible to their anaesthetics, and then thereafter there was quite a mix of opinion. Next slide. So to summarize the survey, most respondents underestimated the significance of nitrous oxide to your carbon dioxide footprint in anesthetics. The vast majority of us don't use nitrous oxide in general adult cases, and there is quite a range of opinion on nitrous oxide use in obstetrics and pediatrics. I think I'll hand back to Anne Harrod.
Thanks, Imran. So yeah, in our project, we've identified out of all the nitrous that we order for the hospital, 85% of it on average across both sites is wasted and essentially just ends up being vented to atmosphere through different means and without contact with the patient. So considering the negative environmental impacts of nitrous, that is quite concerning and something that we would ideally like to improve upon. So looking at the solution, what we can do about this problem, we're sort of broken it down into the different sort of parts along the chain, really. So starting off with ordering and stock management. One thing we identified is order 2 types of cylinders. We order G cylinders, which are the 9,000 litre ones, which we attach to the manifolds. We also continue to order a large number of E cylinders. We've yet to find the E cylinders are used for. None of them appear to be connected to any of our anaesthetic machines cross-site, and nobody else in the hospital uses nitrous other than us. Other people use that really found out where these E cylinders are going, so perhaps we could stop ordering them. On that theme as well, could we just order less in general? It seems a large percentage of what we order ends up being expired and being returned to BOC, who vented to atmosphere.
So I've got a little bit of an update yesterday on the stock management side of things. And actually, we have an automated system where BOC replace like cylinders, and the porters will order more sometimes when they think we need it.
Okay.
Which is certainly somewhere we can address as well.
And then to infrastructure at the hospitals. So specifically to Lewisham, we've identified that we have an entire manifold that supplies an anaesthetic machine in the X-ray department that doesn't even have a vaporizer on it, and log, no one's ever used any nitrous on there. So this entire manifold basically just sits there until it expires, and then it's sent back, vented to atmosphere and replaced. So is there ability to decommission this manifold in particular, and do we need to look at sort of considering using local manifolds within the theatre environment, or even just local cylinders attached to the anaesthetic machine instead of using the main manifolds in general? These are all things we're going to discuss at a managerial meeting at a later point in the next few weeks as well. Moving on to our clinical, I think this is of almost less importance given the majority actually of what we're consuming isn't even reaching patients. But are there any areas where we could reduce usage? One thing that we did sort of note from going through all the anaesthetic machines is that one of the theatres that we actually use most nitrous in is the paediatric theatres, and that's not in the anaesthetic rooms. That's sort of in theatre for maintenance. And from our survey, I think we identified that only 1 in 10 people say that they use nitrous for maintenance of paediatric cases, yet we seem to be turning through amount. So that's one potential area we could look into that, yeah. So those are our sort of main solutions or ideas of solutions we have to the problem. Do you have any other thoughts, Dan or Imran?
Well, I think the one reason why we are not absolutely jumping up and down and saying that we have to decommission the manifolds at UHL is because they have done a leak test, and surprisingly the leak test came back, unlike at other trusts, negative, i.e. we weren't losing much nitrous oxide at UHL lines. But we haven't done the same leak test at QE. And given the frequency with which water falls through the roof, I would be very surprised if we're not losing a hell of a lot of oxide from the QE manifolds. And it just goes with the wider picture in London. I think when we went to that nitrous oxide Pan London meeting, they were saying that there's at least 4 trusts in London that are just losing millions and millions of litres of nitrous oxide to the atmosphere because of leaks in their systems, particularly in their pipeline systems. So definitely, I think we need to do a leak test at QE to establish whether we're losing nitrous oxide, and I think we should seriously consider decommissioning manifolds. And I think we should consider just putting cylinders on the few machines that are in obstetric or pediatric theatres. That would be my suggestion. I think the NHS are going, and I think we'd be wise to take the first steps.
That's a fair comment. But having been round with the gas engineer, actually the variation of the leak test that they did here, he wasn't actually convinced that would identify all leaks, because you have to identify that you've got all your outlets that are connected to anaesthetic machines, and that's not picking up on leaks at those points either. So there are many more parts of that chain.
Yeah.
Where the numbers that Angharad showed earlier, there was like nearly 500,000 litres turned over at the manifold, but at UHL we'd only used 150,000 clinically. Huge discrepancy there.
Yes, I agree. The leak test, I have no confidence that is accurate. and part of the problem why we haven't been able to get leaked because of PFI. Because there's so many different people involved, getting them together to agree on a date in which we're going to do a leak test has been difficult.
The amount of cylinders had expired whilst on the manifolds that were active, which is also slightly worrying.
Yeah.
So that's the end of our presentation. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening. And just to reiterate again, we're not telling anyone that we don't think anyone should be using nitrous. Our project is just based at this system of ordering infrastructure and minimising what's wasted, essentially. But again, thank you very much for your time. We'd also just like to say thank you to quite a lot of effect. So Joanna Tolpert from Draeger has helped us out a lot with software updates. The estates departments over both sites and pharmacy and procurement over both sites have helped us out a lot.